Geeks and geekettes, gats and gittens, comic book lovers everywhere. I am Chuck Dixon, and I'm here to answer your questions. And who the hell is Chuck Dixon? Well, I've worked in comics for close to 4 decades as a working professional. Yep, I wrote comic books all day long and didn't have to take like a real grown-up job. Of course, I worked a lot of real grown-up jobs in the years leading up to being a comic book writer, but let's not talk about that right now. Hey, I apologize. There was no new Ask Chuck Dixon for the last 3 weeks. Nothing wrong, no problem. I just decided to take some time off for the first time in a long time. So I just dealt with necessary business. But now I'm back to making these videos, hopefully on a regular basis. So let's jump right in to the action. Levi Sweeney, what are the core elements of a good superhero story, and what basic things are required to create a good new superhero? Well, a good new superhero is tough, man. I have a theory that all of our great superheroes, our iconic superheroes, for the most part, were created by adolescents, basically teenagers, with the exception of Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, who I think maintained a feeling, maintained the enthusiasm they had as an adult throughout their adult lives, the enthusiasm they had as an adolescent, I meant to say. So I think that, the great heroes, Superman, Batman, characters like that, were created by people that were really earnest about it, and really they had that mixture of ignorance and confidence that I always say is so important in a writer, and certainly important in any creative endeavor. You have to believe in what you're doing and not understand the odds against it being successful. So our lasting, most iconic characters, I think, were created by enthusiasts, eccentrics. Today we call them nerds and geeks, but they've always been with us. Isaac Newton certainly was a geek. So yeah, I think you gotta dig down into your deepest well of wish fulfillment when you create a superhero. And then you have to remember that their secret identity, their alter ego, if they have one, has to be equally as interesting, if not more interesting, than the superhero persona itself. So you gotta make sure you're creating a well-rounded character. And I don't know what superpowers are left, but I've created superhero characters in recent years, but they're unapologetically either pastiches or loving parodies of the genre. For the most part, I don't create new characters. I've done some work in the superhero genre recently, which will soon be announced. It's a rather big project, but they're not characters I created. And I actually enjoy developing other people's superhero characters more than working on my own. Now, the other thing you need conflict. Every superhero story needs conflict, action, violence, if you will. They need a decent set of villains, a decent challenge, something that they have to overcome. And it doesn't, in anything you write, even the superhero genre, you also can't forget heart. Make sure these characters have an emotional life. And I don't mean weepy, cryy, soap opera stuff. Just make sure that there's emotional stakes in what they do. Spider-Man, the first few years of Spider-Man with Stan Lee and Steve Ditko is absolutely the most perfect run of superhero comics I can imagine, because Peter Parker comes to life just as much as Spider-Man does. And in a lot of cases, you're just as concerned for Peter Parker and his troubles and travails as you are for Spider-Man. And also this idea that this kid is imbued with these amazing powers, but his private life is still a mess. And it's a mess in an organic, natural, relatable way. There's no contrivance here. He has an aunt who is ill. He's picked upon at school. He's attracted to a girl that he knows he can never get. All of these things. And I objected strongly when Ditko left, and Stan Lee sort of ironed out all those problems, made Peter Parker hip, and he got the girl and all. I thought that took some of the life out of the story. So yeah, you got to have heart, you got to have conflict, you got to have a well-rounded character, and superheroes go back to the dawn of history. Not to get too Joseph Campbell on you, but Samson, Hercules, characters like that. And it doesn't hurt to look at those mythic characters, not for guidance on how to write your story or how to construct a character, but basically look at what they used to do in these stories that were told, these oral histories of these characters. And there was tragedy in their life. They were well-rounded. Hercules had a terribly tragic history beyond being the strongest guy on the planet. So there's a lot to pay attention to, but for the most part, it's earnestness. And earnestness will solve a lot of your problems, because if you're earnest about the character and you believe in them yourselves, you're going to fill in all of the blanks that I talked about to make us care about the character. But, don't create a person who's like, shoots electric bolts out of their hands, and that's about as interesting as it gets. You need more than that. And, and don't be checking boxes, if you know what I mean. Don't be checking boxes of, if they're this particularly trendy minority or whatever. I mean, if that's a story and that's part of the story, and you make it an interesting part of the story, that's great. But don't include things just because you think by popular taste they need to be there, because these woke elements have been put into so many comics recently are not there because they're popular. If anything, they're quite the opposite. They're put there for other reasons that have nothing to do with creating compelling, interesting, engaging, escapist entertainment. Chart ran Jacob 93. I was curious about your view on the Doom Patrol characters from the Silver Age. The team had a bit of a resurgence following the recent TV series, but the clips I've seen from the show never had me convinced, despite the show's apparently critical acclaim. The series showrunners even described them as Grant Morrison's characters, which I think is a huge slap in the face to Arnold Drake and Bruno Premiani. They were the original creators of Doom Patrol. What are your thoughts, and would you have ever wanted to write a story involving the Doom Patrol? No, Doom Patrol never interested me. I remember the comics when I was a kid, and I think I bought this very issue, the one on the screen now, and maybe one other, and it just seemed weird to me, and I thought it was an attempt by DC to kind of try to catch up with Marvel, to create these a cast of troubled characters to whom their powers were more a curse than a blessing. And, interesting idea and everything else. And I know the Silver Age series has its fans. I'm just not one of them. And the weird thing is, I mean, there's still controversy to this day that has not been solved, is that, here Arnold Drake came up with a superhero team of, misfits and mutants led by a guy in a wheelchair. And almost at exactly the same time, these other characters appear from Marvel. And it's long been talked about and debated within fandom. Was this just an idea that was just pulled out of the ether and it's just coincidence? Or was there some sort of cross-pollination between DC and Marvel? And trust me, as much as DC and Marvel like to pretend that they were rivals, a lot of these guys knew each other, were personal friends, and would see each other at, probably 3 martini lunches and things like that. So they were aware of each other. And of course, you had freelancers going back and forth between the companies constantly, like there was a revolving door. So it's possible that this was like a shared idea at some point, and then, became a reality at both companies at the same time, or just some sort of cosmic coincidence. I think it was just a commingling over drinks late one night, and both series were born there. Now, a Doom Patrol thing I did read and like, I liked John Byrne's run. I bought the big honkin' omnibus and read that, and I really did enjoy it. I usually enjoy John Byrne's work. I mean, the craftsmanship is there. They're fun to read. He's good at sketching in the characters quickly, and I thought it was in keeping with the original flavor of the Doom Patrol. Now, Grant Morrison's run I did not read. I thought the art was ugly, and I'm just not the biggest Grant Morrison fan in the world. I know he has an enormous following, and God bless you if you like Grant Morrison's work. I just don't get it. You know, there are many things I don't get. We'll discuss that in answer to another question later. And Grant Morrison is one of them. And I'm not talking out of school. Well, first of all, I'm talking to all of you. But I think Grant Morrison understands that he doesn't, that I don't get his stuff, and he probably doesn't get mine. Or maybe thinks my stuff is too easy to get. I don't know. But, whatever. Yvonne Magila, I confess that I did not even know that Simpsons ever got a comic book. Okay, just remembering that I'm from another country. Anyway, how was the relation of the comics to animation? Is there any? Did you create any material that was used in animation? There was kind of a blood-brain barrier between comics and animation people. Animation people are welcome at any time to come and write comic books, but it's a one-way street. Generally, unless you're in the Writers Guild, you are not welcome as a comic book writer to write for animation. It's kind of a closed shop. Plus, I never went to Harvard, so I wouldn't have been welcome in the Simpsons writer room. And I don't know. I'll get into that a little bit later, but they obviously did pay attention to the comic books. But now, as for I don't know what country you're from, but in Germany, the Netherlands, France, and Italy, Simpsons comics were reprinted and translated into those languages. In fact, for the longest time, Simpsons were the #1 best-selling comic in Germany. And this is, and we're talking about, not unlike the United States, a vital comic book reading public. I think they had a weekly newspaper or something, and it was all reprints from the American stuff. And when Bongo, or I should say Matt Groening, decided to pull the plug on the Simpsons comics because sales were weak here or falling, and it was no longer a profitable venture. There's a lot of reasons for that I'm not going to go into here. That stopped the publication of the European stuff because they had no material. And I always wondered, well, why didn't one of the European publishers approach Matt Groening and say, could we continue doing Simpsons comics? And maybe he just didn't want to deal with it. But I can't imagine if you're a German publisher, I think it was Carlson, and this is your #1 best-selling title, and it sold well in other countries too. I mean, far, magnitudes greater in sales than the U.S. sales. I have to imagine that the German publisher would have approached them and said, can we continue doing new material? When Marvel stopped doing Conan, they had not lost the license. I mean, originally, when they stopped printing Conan because of poor sales, Italy continued doing Conan comics, and I wrote quite a few of them for Italy, for Marvel Italia. And I always wonder if the German publisher approached Matt Groening and Bongo about this, and he simply said no. So I can't imagine just giving it up. It's a shame because it was probably, it had to be extremely profitable for the European publishers to continue doing it. So that's kind of like money left on the table. But if you're Matt Groening and you're getting that TV money and especially that merchandising money, you probably don't care about, a few Deutschmarks coming your way from the sale of German comics. Now, did they ever use any of my ideas? Yeah, they used a few, but the one that was most obvious was I did a story about the cat lady. There was an entire issue, and it was a story about the cat lady, how she gets basically reformed and turned back into a normal person, and then once again reverts to being cat lady after some traumatic event. I can't remember the entire story, but they did an episode of Simpsons quite like it. that seemed to borrow an awful lot of elements from this story, from this comic. And, I'm like, well, that's what happens. And that's kind of what is a work for hire. Simpsons comics were paying the highest page rates in the business at the time. And so they sort of paid you up front for that offense of them, basically creating a well of material that they could lift from in the future. And they didn't know you would dime. But, that's cool. I understood the game going in. Maybe it's not entirely ethical, but, all the players knew the rules. So, but who really was upset about this was my wife, who plotted this issue. My wife, writing as E. Blackburn, plotted quite a few of my Simpsons stories. And it would usually begin with a conversation, have they ever done? Because she wasn't a big Simpsons fan, and she didn't watch the show. So she didn't know what stories they had done and hadn't done. And she would say to myself and my youngest son, have they ever done? And we would say either, yes, they have done a story like that, or no, they haven't. And then she would go on from there to basically explore this high concept idea she came up with and just fire off a basic plot line to me that included a number of gags, that would be included in the story. And then I would be like, yeah, I either, yes, I really like that one, I can't wait to write it, or no, I can't figure out a way to make that work in a comic. But she wrote a number of them, and she was not happy when my youngest son said that they did an episode about the cat lady that seemed to borrow a lot from this comic book story. Hey, it's an Evum Twin spin. Have you ever worked with, it's John Buscema on a Conan? Why not? Or did you try at the time? Nothing against Gary Kwapis, but I imagine that you would love it. Well, I would. Well, I would have. I would have loved that. But I didn't. I mostly work with Gary, which, nothing against Gary. Gary's awesome. And probably my preferred, Gary and Kike Okatena were my preferred Conan artists. I really loved working with both of them. And because both of them were so into it. They were earnest. I use that word a lot, but I think it's a word we need to use more often. They were genuine, earnest, and real. Now, I did get to work with John Buscema quite a bit, and really, in thinking about this answer, I realized, wow, I worked with him quite a bit. One of my idols, obviously terrific artist. For my money, John Buscema was the most natural drawing talent ever to work in comics. The guy just couldn't do bad drawings. And so many times, because Marvel worked him like a horse. They worked him like a mule. A lot of times they would go to him and he would do these rough layouts for stories. They weren't fully penciled by any means, and they're really rough. And you look at the page, but an inker, particularly inkers who could draw, understood what they were looking at, and they would come up with this marvelous stuff. Because they understood, and it would look like Buscema in the end. It always looked like Buscema in the end, even if it didn't quite look like it in the layouts. I mean, these were rough. These are like Bridgman anatomy drawings. It's really rough. But these artists, and as I say, these artist inkers that could draw, not simply ink, particularly the Filipino artists, could work magic with these things. And here he's inking himself in a 5-issue arc on Warzone, Punisher Warzone. It was initially going to be a 3-issue arc, and John came in in the middle of the 3rd issue and said to Don Daly, could we extend the story a couple more issues? So I found a way. So if you ever read it, it's kind of got an act 1, 2, and 3, and then an act 4 and 5 that grow out of the first 3 acts, but if you're aware of it when you're reading it, you can kind of see, hey, this story was extended a little bit, beyond its original premise. But I was so flattered that he wanted to do more work with me. We also did Punisher, A Man Called Frank, and once again, John came into the offices looking for work, looking for interesting things. I mean, at this point, Buscema was at a point in his career where he could, he'd work on whatever he wanted. If it interested him, he'd work on it. And he said to Don Daly, do you have anything lying around? And Don says, well, I got this Punisher Western. And John's like, give it to me. Give it to me. And he did a fantastic job on that as well. We also did a Punisher annual together, featuring a brand new character called Spartan, a Punisher, like an armored version of the Punisher, a vigilante knockoff that never went anywhere. I think he's completely forgotten to this day. And then we did one other. Actually, my very first story with John Buscema was a Western story in Savage Tales. Once again, Buscema was in the offices. Hey, anything I would be interested in. Not that you have any work for me. Everyone would have work for John Buscema. They keep him busy, 8 days a week. But he was looking for things he wanted to draw. And he was talking to Larry, and Larry said, well, I have this 10-page Western script. And John's like, give it to me, because he liked Westerns. And, we liked the Westerns when John Buscema drew them, too. He could draw all that stuff, and horses, and outdoor stuff, and all the organic stuff in the landscapes, and just terrific at it. So, yeah, over my career, I got to work with Mr. Buscema a number of times, but sadly never on Conan. Ivan, you get a triple spin, my man. How do you write? I mean, how do you actually write? Recently, I read about Robert E. Howard's typewriter and its specific model and how he was capable of typing about 18 hours in a single day. Those pulp guys were monsters. They were brutes. I mean, they were the real deal. Agatha Christie said she only needed a good, stable table and any typewriter and a reasonably quiet place. Tolkien wrote most of his material by hand with some rewriting with pencils and a lot of side notes, all on the very same sheet of paper. And George Martin has that old MS-DOS computer with a very old document processor, which seems to me more a rich people's superstition, but what do I know? So how do you write, and how do you start writing? How did you start writing back in the 80s? Well, this is a deep dive, inside baseball, really geeky. I used to handwrite because I couldn't type. I still can't type to this day. I'm a hunt and peck guy. But Stephen King hunts and pecks. He never learned to type. So, it's not a obstacle if you can't type. I have to see the keyboard for the most part. I have to glance down at it every once in a while to remember where my fingers are supposed to go. But I type pretty fast. Or hunt and peck pretty fast. So anyway, I used to handwrite them. And when I started getting professional work, I hired a friend of mine. His sister could type. And so she would type the stuff up, and I paid her, I think, 50 cents a page. This is mid-'80s. And as I got more and more work, she finally said, I can't keep up with you. I can't. She had kids. She was doing it at home. She said, I can't do it anymore. I can't put the time in. So I'm like, but I have deadlines and I have the script. It's got to be in this week, right? Or next week or whatever. And she's like, look, I'm sorry. So I'm like, well, what do I do? So I might have called somebody. I don't know. But I knew I needed what was then called a word processor. This is before people had computers in their houses. And so I went to an office supply store because that's where you went to buy these things. There was no computer stores. And I walked into the place and I said, I need a word processor that I can have up and running this afternoon without having to read a whole bunch of manuals, because I knew there was manuals involved. So they said, this is the one you want. It was a Brother word processor. And after some, a few disasters and, bumps in the road, I finally learned how to use it. And, of course, no internet available then, no World Wide Web. So I had to print the stuff up on a dot matrix printer and send it off FedEx to all concerned. And so that's how I wrote. Now, obviously, I work on a Word program now, and it's so much easier than that old clunky word processor. I can move stuff around, things you couldn't do on a word processor. It's a glorified typewriter. And so, yeah, I mean, I do the word processing thing on with a Word program now. And of course, it's put into files and emailed off. Look, I'm going to go back to your original question because I think you had some other elements in there. As far as what do I need, um, I just need, time. Um, William Goldman, a screenwriter, extremely successful screenwriter, he said that a writer has to be very jealous at the time of their writing. They have to be protective to make sure nothing interferes with that schedule, with that muse, if you will. So yeah, all I need is time, and I don't even really need a particularly quiet place. When I first showed up at CrossGen before I had an office, I was visiting, and they didn't have an office for me yet, and they were talking about sharing offices. Basically, Mark Wade was in my office; he was still there, so I had no office. And I was there for a few days, and I really wanted to get to work. I wanted to write. I'm there with the artists. I'm feeling this buzz being in this enormous studio filled with all of these talented people. And I wanted to get going. And in the middle of the CrossTown facility, remember all the artists and inkers and colorists and everybody else, letterers, they all worked in this one big building, this big industrial park type building. And they had two community computers in the middle of the place. And there's people walking back and forth and talking and playing music and, grab ass and all over the place. And the community computers were for checking emails, looking for reference, things like that. And so I just sat down one afternoon and started writing a script for one of the books that I would be doing at CrossGen. And I remember I'm typing away, and I feel somebody over my shoulder, and it's someone who's looking, and they're looking at what I'm typing on the screen. I can't remember who it was, but they turn and announce generally to everyone in the building, he's writing! He's writing a story! So they were quite surprised to see, that I didn't need to be locked away in an office or up on top of an ivory tower. Give me a keyboard, put me in front of that screen, and everything around me fades to nothing as I immerse myself in whatever the hell it is I'm making up. So that's how I write. And I've talked before about the pulp guys like Robert E. Howard, guys like Maxwell Grant. Like those guys were just monsters. The amount of words that they could type in one day, just incredible. Just out of their own skulls. Blues Hamilton, what are your thoughts on mythology? Is there any mythological figure you'd like to write? Okay, it's got to be Ulysses. It's got to be the Iliad. When I was a kid, I read a kind of not an adumbrated version of the Iliad. It was a really excellent edition of the Iliad. I think it was called the Churchill edition, and it was basically written, edited for kids to make it easier. Now, it wasn't in any way Bowdlerized. I mean, there's a lot of sex and violence in the Iliad, and a lot of that remained in the children's book. I mean, if you knew what you were reading, if you could read between the lines, you knew what was going on with Circe and the sirens and all that stuff. You could figure that one out. And then the monsters were terrifying. The Scylla, pictured here. Now, if you don't know the story of Ulysses or Odysseus, it follows the Iliad. Well, I said the Iliad, I meant the Odyssey. Anyway, follows the Iliad, the war, the story of the Trojan War, as the epic poem written by Homer or recited by Homer. I don't know if he ever wrote it down. The Trojan horse, created by Ulysses, wins the war, and now the Greeks have won their fight, and they're all going to go home. And Ulysses heads home to his beloved Ithaca, crossing the Aegean and stopping at every damn island. All these islands all existed in real life. Stopping on every island to meet sorceresses and battle monsters and like the Cyclops, the Scylla, and others. And, just having one fantastic adventure after another. And I love the story. I mean, at one point his crew is turned into pigs by Circe, and he has to rescue them. Even though she's fabulously beautiful, he's like, hey, babe, no way, I need my crew back. And you know the story of the sirens. Ulysses is tied to the mast. I mean, this is just great, epic, manly, action-packed stuff. You know, when I was a kid reading it, the Sword and the Sandal movies were big. We used to go to Saturday matinee and watch Batista and Samson and Hercules, you know, chopping people up with swords, and, you know, knocking down temples, and it was all in good fun. But the Ulysses story. I mean, I liked Perseus and Theseus and you know the Minotaur and all those stories about kings worried about prophecies of a man with one sandal or a ship with black sails. Man, I just dug all that stuff. Jason and the Argonauts, all of it. But Ulysses, I think, stuck with me because the monsters are so frightening. The whole situation is frightening. Plus, you have this longing to get home. This guy spends 10, 20 years trying to get back to Ithaca and his beloved wife. And in the end, I think what really put it across for me was it is an awesome revenge story. Because when Ulysses, I don't want to spoil it for you. The story's over 2,000 years old, but I don't want to spoil it for you. But when Ulysses gets back to Ithaca, there's all these cats that have been hanging around his palace because he was the king of Ithaca, hanging around his palace, basically trying to get his wife Penelope to marry them, right? So you had all these suitors just sort of lounging around, you know, eating all the food, drinking all the wine, and they've been basically bumming off of Penelope for all these years, telling her, well, Ulysses is dead. You know, he's dead. He's not coming back. Come on, marry me. Let me be the king of Ithaca. And when Ulysses returns, he knows these guys are just as likely to kill him as welcome him home. And so he sets up this elaborate scheme and murders them all. Just kills all of them. He's reunited with his son and his dog, Argus, and his wife, and they all lived happily ever after. After he kills all of these, you know, layabouts. But yeah, you list hands down, absolutely, my favorite. Hey, Blue, you get a twin spin. Have you ever thought about doing something with the Destroyer novel series? The Destroyer novel series of paperbacks, I think it's still ongoing to this day. There's just like hundreds of these things. Remo Williams and, you know, master of Sananju, a North Korean martial art no one ever heard of till these guys made it up. The Destroyer series is awesome. If you've never read one, it's typical, you know, paperback stuff from the 70s. But the difference here is that there's humor. It's a full bore martial arts, you know, gunfight, action, pulp adventure kind of thing. But it's also somewhat of a parody of the same genre. At the same time, these guys had way too much fun writing these, and some are hysterically funny. They come up with these great villains, great scenarios, and as I said, there's hundreds of them, and they're really an enjoyable read. And the character relationships between Chiyun, Remo's mentor, and Sensei, and Remo are hysterically funny. Some of the great conversations they have, and Chiyun's a terrific character as well. You know, and there's stuff that I still remember from it. I remember that Remo, in order to investigate the Olympics, goes out for the Olympic track team, and he beats all the other runners wearing Italian loafers, chinos, and a polo shirt. He's not dressed like a track star, and he beats them all because he's a master of Shinanju. He's a master of whatever it is he puts his mind to, and he's just this amazing killer character. And there's a lot of parody, there's a lot of social commentary in it. It's just a really fun series. But I've never thought of writing any of it because it seems it takes a certain brand of guy to do that. And for my money, Mike Barron would be the guy to take on the Destroyer mantle. In fact, Mike Barron did write just an excellent and very funny Destroyer novel. That he allowed me to read. I imagine it got published. I don't know. I don't have a copy of it. He sent me the original manuscript, or he emailed me a file to read. And you know, the Destroyer so perfectly matches Mike's particular brand of humor, and also his own knowledge of martial arts and things like that. And he had so much fun with it, as much fun as Warren Murphy and Richard Sapper and a whole raft of other people that have written these and done a uniformly excellent job on them. So yeah, it's not really. I love it, but I don't think I'm suited to write it, and especially after Mike did such an awesome job on his novel. Muttman. What comic series based on a toy line had the best writing, and what storyline should we read? Come on. I know Transformers fans, but come on. It's G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe, I always say G.I. Joe under Larry Hama was so much better crafted than it deserved to be. I mean, no toy line on Earth ever thought they were going to have a comic as cool and excellent and perfectly put together as G.I. Joe. Earnestness comes in here. It was earnestly done by Mr. Hama, and it shows. And he made G.I. Joe cool. He really did. And, he just put everything. He put his heart and soul into this series, still does to this day. And there really isn't any other, nothing comes close. I mean, I mentioned Transformers, and yeah, there's been some great Transformers comics. But Joe takes the cake. And there's been a lot of really lousy toy tie-in comics. I mean, just phoned in, because that's the way you would do them. That's the way, you'd be handed to somebody, usually in-house. They didn't want to do it. They weren't really that interested in the franchise, but, it was a paycheck. With Larry, it was never a paycheck. I mean, it was a paycheck, but it was never about the paycheck. I just think he really dug it. And that's why it was so popular. I mean, just from a success standpoint, G.I. Joe was the #1 best-selling title at Marvel for years, and rightfully so, because it was so perfectly crafted. As far as best story, I can't really remember. I mean, I've read them all, but I can't really remember. I remember scenes. I remember terrific scenes within the series. But generally, Larry didn't do runs. Most of his stories were, standalones, or in some way tangentially carried on one issue to another. But I don't recall any arcs. But his initial run, particularly when guys like Rod Wiggum came on, and G.I. Joe Special Missions. G.I. Joe Special Missions with Herb Trimpe drawing them is that's good stuff. I really would start there, because you learn a lot more about the individual characters. And Special Missions wasn't tied into the release of the toy line as closely as the monthly title was. There was a burden Larry carried that he was tied to the release. We got a vehicle, it's called the Weasel. We need that to be in the next issue. So he would have to make that vehicle prominent in his story. And, did an awesome job doing that. Under those constraints, he did amazing work. But Special Missions, he's freed up a bit more, quite a bit more. And Herb Trimpe's into it. Little side note, Herb Trimpe drew Special Missions for, I believe, a year. And he was getting a little tired of doing the reference and all the rest of the stuff. Wanted to move on to something else. Maybe it wasn't a year. It was like 6 months into the run. And then they said, well, yeah, we'll replace you or whatever. And then within the next few days, his royalty check from Special Missions #1 came in the mail. And he called back and says, I've changed my mind. I want to stay on this book a while longer. So good for you, Herb. Oh, it's a Mutt twin spin. And this is not Mutt, but this is his dog. He didn't want to appear in the twin spin. So he sent me a picture of his dog, which is, I think, some sort of poodle or poodle mix, but looks like a standard. Looks like a big old dog, big old hunting dog. Very cool. French hunting dog, but still a hunting dog. Oh, what's the best Christmas themed comic story? I believe you're saying that I've ever read. Hands down, the one I remember most is Big Christmas. It's Ant-Man's Big Christmas, and it's by Bob Gale, the writer of Back to the Future, the Back to the Future movies, with art by Phil Winslade. And it's a really, really fun Christmas story, free of sentimental schmaltz. It has heart. It has heart, but it's not overly sentimental because I think all of the greatest Christmas stories are free of sentiment, except Christmas Carol. Christmas Carol is not free of sentiment, but it sort of set the template for all the rest. But this is a really cool story. Ant-Man and the Wasps go and they save a little boy's Christmas. And Bob Gale, it's one of his earliest forays into comics. He's one of the guys from outside of comics, and a very successful screenwriter. A few guys from outside comics who got the medium, who understood how to write a comic book story and do a really good job. I've never read a bad Bob Gale comic book story. I mean, he really understands the language of comics. And of course, aiding him is Phil Winslade, one of my favorite artists, who I've spoken over in a recent video. And it's just a terrific little book. I think it's like 48 pages, might be 64, I'm not sure. But it's just a one-off Christmas thing done under the Marvel Knights banner. And if you can find it, I've probably just driven up the eBay price 5 times by mentioning it. But there you go. J. Haley Tang. You mentioned in one of your previous videos that it's good research for writers to read criticism, reviews of works they like to understand varying perspectives. Now, I know of some pretty good film and literary critics, reviewers, but for the life of me, I have never been able to find any good comic book reviewer critics. So I was wondering, could you recommend anybody? No. Because most of your comic book critics are, egghead hipsters who, maybe they're comic book wannabe creators or whatever reason, or they're comic book scholars or, English majors, even English professors. And they generally get everything wrong. They like the comics for all the wrong reasons. I've never read a decent criticism of comics except Robert Warshaw in the 50s wrote a book called The Immediate Experience. He didn't write a book. There's a collection of his essays called The Immediate Experience. And he wrote criticism of EC Comics in the 50s. And it's a rather detailed criticism. He wanted to see what his son was reading. And he, basically trashed the comic book medium. He was no comic book fan. But he writes a very wonderful, insightful examination because he said that of all the comics that his kid read, the EC comics were of the highest quality, both art-wise and literary. And he was still troubled that his son was reading them, but he goes through a very insightful examination of the EC comics. As a total comic book outsider, it's fascinating to read. And I learned a lot from it because he is from outside. And that's really the problem, because when outside agencies like Entertainment Weekly or Rolling Stone or something like that, when they review a comic book or usually a graphic novel, it's from some sort of highfalutin intellectual aspect. It's a graphic novel that deals with something political or something controversial, or is generally seen as being highly intellectual in some way, artsy. And they'll review them. And those reviews are like, you're not going to learn anything from those reviews because these are, once again, are comic book outsiders who really don't understand how the medium works, have no real appreciation for it, except whatever the subject matter of the graphic novel interests them. And they write from that aspect, but there's no, and then you have things like the publications like the Comics Journal, egghead intellectuals. If you ever want a good laugh, and it's sort of a sad laugh, Fantagraphics, who publish Comics Journal, they're doing a terrific series of hardbound Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge books. They're collecting all of Karl Barks' stuff, and these beautiful hardcover editions. The art is all restored and everything else. And thank you for that, Fantagraphics. So it's a service to humanity and comic fans everywhere. But in the back, they have the stories, analysis of each story by a bunch of, academic types. And they invariably get everything wrong. They miss everything that made the story great. They go into all this like hidden symbolism that nobody saw but them. They go into all kinds of like minutia about the story and totally miss what Barks was doing. I mean, from a standpoint of timing, pacing, characterization, setting up gags, resolution of gags. I mean, all stuff that Barks was an absolute genius at. It seems to elude them. So it's like pointless, other than to laugh at them, get a little chuckle. It's pointless to read them because you're not going to learn anything, and you should learn something from criticism. So no, there's no really any comic book critic I can turn to. And I look at the websites and stuff, and I see reviews that are just they're not helpful. They're not helpful. I mean, when you read a good movie review or a good book review, it's basically taking the material apart and examining it, why it works, why it doesn't. Nobody really writes like that for comics. If there are people that write like that for comics, about comics, let me know, because I'm unaware of them. I mean, there's probably 6 great websites where people tear comics apart and let us see the mechanics and explain things and all the rest, but I'm not aware of them. And I think it would take a comic book professional to really write good comic book criticism. But as I will discuss later, most of us are loath to do that. We're loath to criticize a fellow creator's work. Now, you'll see me here praising people like Jack Cole and Carl Barks and John Stanley, but I'm not really criticizing them as much as examining work that I already know I like. You're not going to see me on here telling you this comic sucks for these reasons, even though there's a lot of them out there that suck. I mean, and let's face it, from the beginning, from the dawn of comic books history, there's been sucky comics, but I'm not going to get into, that kind of mean-spirited nonsense. If I did, I'd probably have more viewers, but I don't want to go there. I want you to leave this, damn it, I want you to leave this little broadcast here feeling good. So I'm not going to get in the mud. Hey, Mr. Tang, you got a twin spin. I've rarely ever heard you, here we go. I've rarely ever heard you say anything terribly malicious about any other comic industry people. Not terrible. I've never said anything malicious, but based on I've never said anything even tepidly malicious. Okay, but based on a couple of things you've said, I got a feeling you're not extremely fond of Sam Keith. I know he drew a couple of covers for Detective Comics when you were writing it, so I was wondering if you two butted heads at any point, or it's just a stylistic difference of opinion. Oh man, you're bad. You're bad, Tag. You're a bad man. You're trying to stir stuff up. You're kicking the hornet's nest. I will not be baited. Because who wants that? Who wants to see that fight? Like the man said, you don't get in an argument with someone who buys ink by the gallon. I don't want to start anything, but it's like any other community. And in comics, you've got artistic people and you've got egos and everything else. So it's probably worse than a lot of other working environments in that aspect. So people are going to butt heads. They're going to lock horns. They're going to, whatever other cliche you want to throw in there, cross swords, so throw fists, whatever. I mean, I've never actually had a fight with Sam Keith or anything else. It's just largely a difference in creative outlook. There are simply artists whose appeal I do not understand. This is not a picture of Sam Keith, by the way. So I don't understand the appeal. But if you like their stuff, hey, good for you. You probably wouldn't like a lot of the people I like. I have to defend Frank Robbins all the time. So genius artist, but a lot of people can't see it. A lot of average comic fans can't see that Frank Robbins was a genius. But there's going to be differences. I mean, you can't like everybody you meet, but I'm not going to get into the arena here and say, hey, well, this guy, and go on and on and on, unless you happen to run into me at a convention. But here in a public forum, I'm not going to be brutally honest about some of the people I work with. And I gotta say, 99% of the people I've worked with in comics have been, gentlemen and ladies. They've been perfectly wonderful. Just sweetheart, sweethearts, just great people to work with because it's a brotherhood, it's a sisterhood, it's a community. I hate that word. It's a tribe, more accurately, of people that love comics and create comics and all the rest of it. And we're generally very supportive and we all like each other. But there are exceptions and there are people that just rub me the wrong way. But that's always going to happen. You're always going to meet that person. And a lot of times I've found, but not in the instances I'm thinking of right now. But every once in a while, in your own life, you probably run up against somebody that you just like for the very first second just didn't get along with. And if you examine it later in the cold light of reason, and probably years later, you realize that the reason I didn't like that person is they're too much like me. So again, I'm not going to leave, I'm not going to get bitter and nasty because I don't feel that way. There's no payback here. I don't feel a desire for payback. After all these years in comics, after all the times I've been burned and screwed and talked bad about, because, I'm a happy warrior. I'm fine. I've done great. Very lucky guy. I got to do what I love. And I want you to feel leave this broadcast feeling good, loving comics, because there's a lot to love. John Bua. I missed CrossGen when it first came out as I was starting my after college career and I was super broke. Understood. Now I am playing catch up. What with Marvel and DC shooting themselves in the foot yet, shooting themselves in the head, I think, I still have a desire to read comics. I'm really enjoying the quality of CrossGen. I read Brath and I'm currently reading Way of the Rat. I heard you say that there was supposed to be a company-wide crossover, but the company folded before that happened. Do you know what that event was supposed to be and what was going to happen? CrossGen was, I'm glad you like the quality, but the thing is, if you put CrossGen in perspective, if you look at CrossGen in the time in which the comics were appearing, they were the highest quality comics on the stands at the time. They were like European quality comics as far as coloring and presentation and trade dress and everything. Just the best looking books out there. And now it's the norm to see comics of that level of quality in production and everything else, but not before CrossGen. CrossGen was really the first. They set the bar, and DC and Marvel and all the other companies were forced to follow with more attention paid to coloring and things like that, and presentation. And it was I kind of lost. There was an element of your question. Oh, the company-wide crossover. Well, anyway, I'll get to that. I'm glad you're enjoying Way of the Rat and Brath as well. It was a lot of fun working there. I've talked about this before. I talked about it earlier in the video, how much fun I had working there. But overall, there was there was always. CrossGen was from its inception a big cross-company event. Every issue was part of this enormous event. And I think that was part of the downfall of CrossGen, is that there was an Uber story that you were required to be interested in. And Mark Alessi, who ran the company, had the misguided notion that it would make people buy all the books because they wanted the whole story. But as usual with a comic book publisher, readers chose titles they liked, titles they didn't, and they followed those titles. And after a while, if you were slavishly following those titles, it led to confusion because you weren't getting the whole Uber story, which was confusing enough to begin with. Myself, I rejected the idea of the Uber story. I spoke out against the Uber story. I never read the binders filled with outlines of what the Uber story was about. I wrote just enough, with the help of the other writers, just enough Uber story material included in Way of the Rat and Brath and Sigil and Crux to make Mark happy. But we saw failing sales as some of the titles were just dragging the line down. They should have been canceled and replaced with something else, but Mark wouldn't allow it because those initial titles, like The First, and there was some title with a sorceress, the sales were cratering on them, but Mark wouldn't allow us to cancel them and replace them because they were such an important part of the Uber story. So it was really cart before the horse kind of thinking. Um, and as I said, for the most part, I didn't participate. In fact, to the point where when I created the book El Cazador, it had nothing to do with the Uber story. It was set on Earth, unlike all of the other comics that were set on um, planets like Earth. Another element that made no sense to me. It was confusing. To have a book like Ruse, which is obviously set in Victorian London, but it's not London, and it's not on Earth, it's not England. You can't make references to the Union Jack. You had to come up with these amalgams, this made up stuff, these avatars for places and events and people. And it's just to a novice or a newbie reader coming in, it must have been extremely confusing. Is this London? No, it was like Arcadia. I mean, why are the place names the same? And it made it difficult to write this stuff. Now, as far as the event, we got Mark to agree to bring the Uber story to a head, bring it to some sort of a conclusion, and then sort of like a big bang, we could collapse this universe and then boom, start another one. And we convinced him to do that, and it was going to all be done through a book called Negation, which was written by Tony Bedard and drawn by Paul Pelletier. And we were all very excited about it because, first of all, the Uber story was going to come to a close. And secondly, Tony and Paul were killing it on this book. It was action-packed. Tony somehow made the Uber story make sense. So you could follow it, and it was impactful and interesting. And for my part, mostly because it was funny. He wrote some hysterically funny scenes in this series, and it's very much a huge world-spanning, universe-spanning, space opera, combined with a lot of superhero elements. And it was action-packed and huge and everything else. And I don't think it was ever completed because the company went under before all of this could have come to pass. And I don't think it would have saved us anyway. As excellent as Negation was and would have been, I don't think it was going to save us because the writing was on the wall. And people had basically stopped, except for a few titles like El Cazador and Sojourn, had stopped buying CrossGen. And, it's just it was the timing. It was the timing. If CrossGen had appeared a few years later, I think it would still be here. Although Mark still would have made the same mistakes he made. Nothing against Mark. He just made a lot of mistakes that anybody would have made. And he took some advice from people that didn't have his best interest at heart. And as he told me a number of times, he didn't listen to me enough. Not to go Joe Biden where I'm the hero of every story, but I wanted the company to survive. I wasn't about how much money can I make now, how many perks can I get now. It was about I want to be here for a while. I want this mission to make it to its destination, but it didn't, sadly. But we changed comics forever. We changed American comics forever. You were never going to see cheap jack, shoddy, crappy, not crappy, I shouldn't say, but limited palette of color and stuff like that. You were never going to see that again in comics. We taught readers to expect more. And I'm proud of that. Hey, it's a Buatan twin spin. This is the most awesome picture anybody's ever given me for a twin spin. That is so freaking amazing. Okay, John's got a long question here. So I got a long answer. I heard you say that no one was more selfish than Frank Castle. I meant self-centered. I thought about that for a while and really made me think that perhaps no one gets the character as well as you. Now, do you think Frank would have been a good, loving father knowing how selfish he was? I dated a woman years ago who said that Frank was a serial killer. He was a serial killer whose prey was criminals. Before her comment, I thought of Frank as a good guy, kind of a power fantasy tough guy, but since I've thought of him in a more sinister light. Serial killers have an uncontrollable need to kill. Does Frank have that need? What would have happened had his family never been murdered? Would he have served his need over his family? Would he suppress that need? I'm of the opinion that he would have turned villain had his family lived. He would be an adequate father, providing what they needed as a father, but lacking the loving and warmth of a dad. Well, part of what you say I agree with, part of it I don't. Frank was not a serial killer, is not a serial killer. Because what a serial killer is a serial killer is someone who, for whatever reason, brain chemistry, youth trauma, whatever, they're a person who are not empathetic. They don't care about the feelings of others. They only care about their own feelings. Most importantly, they live in a fantasy world. And most serial killers are trying to make that fantasy come to life. The recent Idaho killings is a perfect example. This guy got a master's degree in criminology because I think he planned on being a serial killer. That's how obsessed he was. And this was his first foray. And even though he had a master's degree in criminology, he made every mistake in the book, even though he interviewed, apparently, hundreds of criminals, asking them how they succeeded, how they failed. He was basically trying to research how to commit the perfect crime. And from every outside thing, it would have been perfect. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but it is topical. He was a stranger to his victims. He had no connection to them and everything else. But he didn't. He made a lot of bonehead mistakes that were 21st century mistakes, things with his phone and things like that, that led to his capture and hopefully eventually conviction and execution, if I had my way. And it is Idaho. I think they might still hang there. Anyway, so back to the Punisher. Punisher had no fantasies about killing people. A lot of times he's killing people remotely. He's not there. As I made clear in my Warzone run, he does not torture people. He might make them think they're being tortured, but he's not torturing them because the Punisher is not a sadist. He's not in this for the fun. He is a soldier. And I think the template for Punisher was originally, the crazy Vietnam War vet. It became a cliche in the 70s. A cliche not founded in fact. We didn't have a lot of crazy Vietnam War vets running around the country shooting everything up. That didn't happen. A lot of what we know, what we quote unquote know about the Vietnam War today is false if you do any kind of research. It's the most misunderstood conflict that the United States has ever been in. But Frank Castle, nonetheless, is a result of this, fictional trope of the gun crazy, trigger happy Vietnam vet, going off having a war on crime. And of course, these all grew out of Punishers, very much inspired by the paperback novels of the 70s. Vietnam vet vigilantes, taking it to the streets. But in a larger sense, it's based on any veteran of any war. You come back. I grew up in my neighborhood. All the dads were World War II vets, all of them, and a lot of them were combat vets, and they'd seen wicked stuff. Now, these were men who were trained to be killers, and even if they hadn't killed anybody in combat, they were trained to be killers under harsh conditions. And even if they didn't kill anybody themselves in combat, they saw some horrible stuff in the Pacific, in Europe. They saw stuff that, these are young men, average age, average age of a World War II vet is like 24, 25. So you got a lot of 18, 19-year-olds, fresh out of high school, and they're seeing horrific things. Which you're going to do in any war, but in World War II particularly, there's some really ugly stuff going on. These guys saw, and it has to scar you. And I know from my own dad, who was a bombardier B-17s in World War II, obviously responsible for a lot of deaths. Saw horrible things happen in the air to people that were friends of his. And all of these guys that came back from the Pacific, they came back from Europe, trained killers, in some instances had killed. And now they had to lead normal lives. They had to put that aside and lead normal lives and marry and raise children, and, move to the suburbs and have a job and a house and a car and a dog and all the rest and try to get back to normal. But it was a struggle. And I know a lot of dads, particularly like in the late 50s, early 60s, who had breakdowns because of the experiences, because trying to, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, trying to forget what they had been through. And, because they didn't deal with it at the time, and now they were dealing with it. And on top of that, they were dealing with the stress of raising a family and a mortgage and a job and all the rest of it. And an awful lot of dads ended up, at VA hospitals and things like that, to be treated in whatever way they could do back then, treat, whatever they called it, combat fatigue, or, whatever they called it at the time. Vietnam era, they called it combat shock, until we came up with the, more scientific term of post-traumatic stress disorder. And Frank would have been one of those guys. It was the horrible stuff that he saw in Vietnam, stuff he had to do, people he had to kill, friends he saw die. He was going to come home and forget all about that and be a good dad, be a good provider, raise a family, and maybe a few years into his new civilian life, he would need therapy, and maybe he would have sought it. And I think that's Frank Castle. He would have been a normal guy. As badass, exterminating the son of a bitch as he is, he willingly would have put that behind him. And then his family gets murdered, and that's when he has his breakdown. That's when he goes off, and he never comes back, and he can never bring his family back. And some people say that Frank has a death wish. I don't believe that, because if he dies, then there's a whole lot of people he didn't get to kill who he thinks deserves it. I mean, he wants to send as many bad guys to hell before him as he can. He wants to walk into a hell on a 20-mile road lined with corpses, paved with the corpses of the evil men that he's killed. And but yeah, I mean, I don't think he's a serial killer. I don't even think he's psychotic. I think he's broken and has no interest in repairing himself. He is focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is killing criminals of the type that killed his family, ultimately to spare other families that pain. So I think he's still a hero. Does he act like a villain? Yes. But that's what we love about him. We love the fact that he acts like a villain, that he is remorseless, seems not to have any empathy, seems not to have any heart or sympathy for anybody. And I think that's what we dig about him. And that's the wish fulfillment fantasy, the wish fulfillment tough guy fantasy. If you want to reach me, if you want to ask me questions like these folks did, these were great questions this week, great questions every week. You people are awesome. You make me think. I learn too, because, I get to articulate stuff that I've only maybe thought about or vaguely thought about in passing. And I really got to delve deep into the memories to answer these questions. But anyway, if you have a question, suggestion, picture of your dog, picture of your cat, whatever, send it to brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com. Get you on my mailing list so I can let you know I got some exciting stuff coming up that you're going to want to know about. It's the most direct way to reach me. And, I will most likely, find your question there and put it up here. And while I got you, are you reading My Sister Suprema? It's at ArcTunes. I'll have the link below. My Sister Suprema by me and Anthony Gonzalez Clark. It is a superhero parody. A young boy, Randy Diaz, he wants to be a superhero, and he performs an experiment he finds on a mysterious website. But accidentally, it turns his sister Cecilia, his big sister, is a superhero and not him. And now he has to live vicariously through her while teaching her how to be a superhero, something that she has absolutely no interest in. So if you're not reading it, you should. It's free. It's a lot of fun. Anthony and I, well, Anthony just brings it. He brings it in every episode. I write what I think is going to be some pretty funny stuff, and then Anthony makes it hysterically funny. He is so darn good, and I'm so glad I found him. And as I said, you can find it at ArcTunes, which is brought to you from Archaven Comics. ArcTunes is a free digital service, costs you absolutely nothing. Comics in high res. And My Sister Supreme will be coming soon to Spin Rack, a new venture, a multimedia venture. And you'll be seeing My Sister Supreme in a whole new venue at Spin Rack. The comics remain at ArcTunes, but you'll soon see what exciting things we're going to do with My Sister Suprema and other intellectual property that I'm involved with at Spin Rack. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching, listening, subscribing, likes, whatever. Thanks for spreading the word. Thanks for your questions. They've been terrific.